So welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about GDPR, what it means and what we're doing about it. In addition to the announcement we made the other day that I believe most of you should have received, we wanted to take this session, take an opportunity to talk about some details and maybe make things easier to understand with regards to this new regulation and how it might apply to us, to our customers, and to our bot users or your bot users. So with us today, we have three participants. Dr. Christian Schroeder, who's a partner at Orrick, Harrington and Sutcliffe LLP in Düsseldorf, Germany. He's our legal counsel who assists us through this process, and he will cover all the legal aspects of GDPR and what we're doing with regards to it. Dmitry Kotlerov, Chatfuel's Director of Engineering, who will touch on all the technical and organizational measures that we've been implementing as a party subject to GDPR compliance. And myself, Dmitry Kachin. I am head of partnerships at Chatfuel, and I will help keep this presentation hopefully flowing smoothly today. We treat data security and personal data privacy seriously, and we're fully committed to it and fully committed to meet the requirements of this important legislation. And we'd like to share with you what it means and what we've done. So we're going to jump right in it. We'll start with a quick and sort of short version of what GDPR is and what it means for Chatfuel, our customers and their bot users. Then we'll get into the details of what Chatfuel has done to address the GDPR requirements, both on the legal side and on the technical side, as well as what happens next. We'll get to questions in the end. We have more than 500 people registered for the webinar. Fewer than that are attending at the moment, but we are not going to be able to take questions from the field today, but we took all the questions that you asked during the registration and all the questions that we received previously, and we condensed them to the ones that people are asking most frequently. So we will address them, and hopefully it'll help you answer your questions that you have about GDPR, Chatfuel and bots and how it all fits together. So with that, I will pass, before I pass it on to Christian, let's take a look at GDPR and try and understand what it really is in hopefully simple terms. It's actually a lot more complicated than this, but the EU General Data Protection Regulation, which is what GDPR stands for, replaces the 1995 EU Data Protection Directive. And what this law does is it strengthens the rights that individuals have regarding personal data relating to them. It means that organizations that have access to and process the personal data of EU-based users are subject to new rules and regulations. And we'll talk about that today. We'll get into some detail later. So what does it mean for Chatfuel, for our customers and the end users of bots? In simple terms, for Chatfuel, it means that we have to implement specific contractual terms for data processing and make them available to all of our users, as well as we have to put in place and document strict technical and organizational measures and follow them in line with what GDPR requires in that regard. For our customers, everything that we're doing and everything that GDPR requires means better user data security on more favorable legal usage terms. And for bot users, it again means increased security with more control over their individual personal data. So what have we done to comply? To talk about that from the legal perspective, we've asked Christian Schroeder from Orrick to help us with that. So Christian, please go ahead and take us through this.
controllers. Chatfuel is subject to basically 5 obligations under GDPR. On the one side, the same as all customers, all data controllers are as well. It needs to enter into a so-called data processing agreement, and we will go into more detail later on. As Dimitri already mentioned, it also needs to have appropriate technical and organizational measures to prevent against, for example, hacking, unauthorized access, and use in place. It needs to maintain a record of processing activities. That means simply a kind of basic description of its processing operations, contact information, and so on, which you can request at any time. It needs to point out a representative if necessary. Chatfuel will do so. And needs to designate a data protection officer if so necessary. And as you may know, Article 37 does not require everyone to have a DPO, but it's only required in very specific cases, and we have determined that this is not the case for Chatfuel. Can we then move on to the next slide? Dimitri? Sorry, Dimitri, can we move to the next slide?
Yeah, I already did. Can you see it?
Oh, okay, but it doesn't pop up on my screen. Then it's fine. So the structure of and the key terms of the data processing agreement, which you will receive shortly, I will briefly explain so that it's easier for you to kind of go through it. So first of all, the agreement consists out of 4 parts. It will be part of Chatfuel's terms of use. It contains the so-called standard contractual clauses for processors. That's a basic set of terms and conditions published by the European Commission, must not be changed. That refers back to an appendix 1, which contains a high-level description of the processing activities, and the appendix 2, which contains a description of the technical and organizational measures that we have already talked about. And the DPA also contains specific provisions on the use of sub-processors. What are these kind of technical and organizational measures? And that's it's a description of specific features that any company should address, and these features will be addressed in the data processing agreement. So you will find specific descriptions on the admittance control, the physical access, the system access, data transmission, confidentiality and integrity in general, and job control. Dimitri, can you switch the slide again? Okay, right now that's perfect. Okay, good. So let's go back to the agreement. So basically, this agreement will, as already mentioned before, clarify the position in which Chatfuel as a data processor is. It very clearly states and confirms that any processing of personal data that you as data controller receive or as a processor receives will be done only on your behalf and under your instructions. So that's very clear. Chatfuel has no means to retain, to use, or otherwise process the data for any whatever purposes, for no purposes. And of course, at the end of any contractual relationship and upon your request, Chatfuel will also delete the data. That's an important part of compliance under GDPR. The agreement will also detail the subject, duration, purpose of the entire processing. And if you wonder why this agreement is so long, it's simply because of the law requires so. So Article 28 of GDPR contains a subset of various specifications which require both the data controller and the data processor to agree on. all these specific measures will be addressed in the agreement. In clause number 3, the agreement also refers to the standard contractual clauses, and I've already mentioned that's a subset of clauses which has been issued by the European Commission. Why do we have such a combination of 2 different clauses in one agreement? For the following reason. Article 28 under the GDPR again requires the controller and the processor to enter into a general data processing agreement. And these requirements apply to any entity, be the entity residing in the EU or outside the EU. So that's the same. However, whenever data is being processed outside the EU, the EU has certain restrictions. As you may know, that the EU wants to kind of protect the data even when the data leaves the EU. And as a result, processors or any other recipients outside the EU, they need to observe certain rules. There's various ways to kind of address this and to provide appropriate guarantees. One way is, for example, to have so-called binding corporate rules in place. Another one is to, in particular for processors in the United States, is to sign up to the EU-US Privacy Shield. I'm sure you have already heard about them. But another one, and that's also really the standard, is to enter into an agreement which incorporates these standard contractual clauses for processors, which have been approved by the European Commission. And if they are used in unmodified form, then any data controller located in the EU can engage with such a processor who has signed up to this. These standard contractual clauses apply worldwide, so they can be used in India as well as in the United States, and they are not in no way better or worse than the EU-US Privacy Shield. But the EU-US Privacy Shield would also not kind of relieve you from the obligation to enter into a data processing agreement anyways, and that's why you will often find these data processing agreements as we drafted it. So you have the main body of the agreement and the standard contractual clauses embodied in it, so that both the standard contractual clauses and the new Article 28 of the GDPR is met. That's the main part of that agreement. And then the agreement clarifies further of Chatfuel's obligations. So, for example, Chatfuel needs to react and notify you in case of any data breach. That it will enable you to also potentially notify the data protection supervisory authorities and or the data subjects if so required under applicable law. As you may know, under GDPR, there's a fairly strict tight timeline for any such breach notification. So it's just 72 hours. So in order to do so, you need to be ensured that you get promptly informed of all your processes. We have provided so that Chatfuel is also obliged to inform you in case it had reason to believe that any such unauthorized access has occurred. In addition, there's a kind of fairly long part of the agreement which describes the documentation and audit rights, where Chatfuel will help you also to kind of comply with your obligations under GDPR. It is provided that Chatfuel, for example, assists you with queries that you may get from individuals that reach out to you, for example, regarding a right to access, right to delete. Chatfuel in all these instances cannot act on its own. It needs to revert to you as the data controller. Or again, if you as data processor as well on behalf of another data controller, then it will follow your instructions, will follow you. So there's a clearly ensured that there's a line of legal obligations between Chatfuel, you and the data controller. And if the data controller issues any instructions, it is clarified that eventually then down the line, Chatfuel will follow that instruction as well. And of course, the same obligations apply also to Chatfuel. So for Chatfuel's sub-processors. Chatfuel has certain sub-processors in place. It uses them for the processing of the data. And of course, as required under Article 28, as well as under this agreement, Chatfuel has passed down these obligations to all these subcontractors. And if so requested by you, you can have a copy of these agreements so that you can satisfy your own legal obligations to document that you have done a proper due diligence. The agreement also clarifies how rights to rectify, erase, or restrict the further processing will be implemented. But it also kind of clarifies your obligations as a customer. If you that instructions generally should be kind of given within the framework of this agreement. Of course, I mean, you cannot instruct entirely different things, but if you, for example, have a certain instruction and such an additional instruction need to be put in writing, that's all in line with Article 28. You will also find some of the approved subcontractors in the agreement so that you can identify these subcontractors and be aware of them. Should any changes be made to the subcontractors, Chatfuel will provide appropriate notice so that you can review and potentially object if you're not fine with that, which hopefully won't be the case. These are the main requirements under the agreement. And as I mentioned before, in Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, you will find the additional information regarding the processing operations and particularly the standard contractual clauses that are met. And this is also the main requirement for Chatfuel. As I mentioned, there are some further additional requirements for Chatfuel, which is the records of processing activities. That is not something that needs to be published, such as a privacy notice. It's simply a document that Chatfuel has on file and which is happy to share with you if so requested. It's also happy to share it with individuals if they request or with the data protection supervisory authority. Since Chatfuel has no establishment in the EU, it also needs to have a representative in the EU, and Chatfuel will have appointed one by you by then and will also inform you thereof if so requested. These are the main obligations, and we're confident that once you have had time to review the DPA, you feel comfortable with these ones, and happy to address questions. Dimitri, do you want to continue?
Thank you for taking us through this, Christian. Appreciate you doing this. There's a lot of legal stuff, a lot of legal considerations. I hope that all of your heads are not spinning like mine because of all of this. So we're going to switch gears real quick and move on to Dmitry Kotlярov, our Director of Engineering, who will take us through the technical and organizational security measures that we've implemented to comply with the requirements of GDPR. Dmitry, please go ahead.
Hello, do you hear me well?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Nice, nice. So I've been driving the technical side of the GDPR compliance effort throughout the last several months, and wanted to briefly overview the actions we've taken to make sure our platform is fully compliant. But before going into some of the details, let me briefly share the framework we used to structure our work on the security side. So if you take a broader view on the subject of security, you'll quickly realize that it has many facets. And to make sure that we tackle every single aspect of it, we organized all the measures into 8 categories that you currently see on the slide. Each group of measures is aimed to address a specific set of security threats and typically consists of both technical and organizational items. For example, system access, a set of measures that is aimed to make sure that only authorized users can access Chatfuel's internal systems. And it includes securing access to production servers, as well as working out procedures of activating and deactivating users and so forth. Or availability, which focuses on following best-in-class availability standards to make sure that personal data is not only secure, but also remains available even when some of the components fail. And more on that on the next slide. Yep. So here I wanted to share some of the examples of probably the biggest technical efforts we made during this journey. The first one is availability. So one of the important principles of building reliable systems is eliminating single points of failure. These are usually critical, unique components which may bring the entire system down when they fail. And such failures are not necessarily software related, because hardware can fail too. And even though we deploy our infrastructure only using the most reliable cloud service providers like Azure, Google Cloud, and Amazon, servers may still shut down literally anytime due to a physical outage or service maintenance or whatever. So we must be prepared for all sorts of things. And I'm very happy to say that we made a major effort redesigning our entire architecture to provide redundancy of every critical component. The next one is data encryption. Here we thoroughly reviewed and redesigned our storage systems to ensure that all pieces of personal data are encrypted at rest. And this required a massive redesign of our databases infrastructure. And we also had to scale it to make sure that performance of our platform is not affected, because encryption doesn't come for free. And while doing this, we have not only improved database security, but also automated the entire infrastructure layer, making it possible to scale it out very quickly in case of increased load. So also very proud for that too. And the last but not least is securing traffic. We've tightened up our firewall rules and made sure that traffic does not leave our private networks unless it is necessary to provide our service. And this was both a technical and organizational effort, since it required not only reworking our networking layer, but also defining principles that we follow when building networks and setting up various procedures of auditing and updating our firewall rules, and so on. And these are only a few examples. So we've implemented tens of measures overall, and to provide a compliant and secure platform you guys can build upon. And the more details you will find in our data processing agreement that is coming soon. And that's it for me.
Thanks very much, Dimitri. Appreciate you taking us through all of this. Again, great work. And we, as you guys can see, we've done quite a bit to make sure that we're operating in compliance with the GDPR requirements, and we've taken care of all of the various measures that are required of us as a data processor to be in place. And all of this becomes available to all of the users of Chatfuel once GDPR comes into force. So what happens next? Before May 25th, actually, we hope it's going to happen in the coming days. We're just clarifying the last details of the full wording of the data processing agreement that Christian talked about and walked us through. We will be providing the full wording as an addendum to our terms of use to all of our users in the dashboard. So going forward, everything that we do with regards to GDPR and data privacy related to the regulation is going to be governed by this agreement, and you can use it to discuss GDPR compliance with regards to use of Chatfuel with third parties, with your customers, and so forth. And you can have access to all the details of everything that we talked about today and much more in the agreement itself. And if you have any questions about it, please let us know. But you should see that pop up in your dashboard very, very soon. And from that point on, all of the specifics of GDPR and all the things that we should be able to do and to comply with from the standpoint of user data security and privacy is going to be enforceable. And as part of what it means, we're going to look at some of the questions that came in. Hopefully this will help put it all into perspective for all you guys. So first question is, what is personal data? So the way it's defined under GDPR is personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person or data subject. An identifiable person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as name, email address, or location, and also online identifiers like IP address, types of website cookies, and other device identifiers. So it's universally understood that the definition of personal data is really, really broad. So in our case, in case of bots, I think most bots are going to be subject to basically having access to personal data of individuals who are communicating with them. Who are data controllers, processors, and sub-processors? Christian alluded to it earlier, but a data controller is the entity or person that determines purposes and means of processing personal data of the EU resident. For example, Chatfuel in our case is a data processor, and depending on their function, Chatfuel's customers, bot creators, are either controllers or primary processors in relation to personal data subject to GDPR. So it's important to understand that distinction and understand how you fit in as a bot creator using Chatfuel. Are you a data controller or a data processor? Depending on the situation, it could be both or either one. Does the GDPR require EU data to stay, be hosted or stored in the EU? The answer is no. The GDPR does not require EU personal data to stay in the EU, nor does it materially change the current landscape for data transfers outside the EU. Data transfers from the EU to outside can be legitimized in many ways, including EU-US Privacy Shield model or contractual clauses, which is what our data processing agreement is based on, and binding corporate rules. So as you know, our servers are located in the continental United States, and that's where we store and process the data. And that's why we're basing our data processing agreement on model or contractual clauses, and that's in line with GDPR requirements. Does GDPR apply only to the EU residents' personal data? The answer is no. GDPR does not only cover EU residents' data. For example, data of US residents would also fall under GDPR to the extent that an EU-established entity processes such data in the EU. So it could go both ways. It's not as simple as just the EU subjects subject to GDPR requirements. How to ensure compliance if I'm using third-party integrations such as Zapier or Integromat and so on? If you elect to integrate a third-party service to pass your bot users' data to, you need to ensure that the service has taken all the necessary measures to be compliant with GDPR. It's important to make that distinction since bot admins have direct access to data and control how data gets to Chatfuel, as well as where the data goes outside of Chatfuel. The bot admins would be bound by GDPR rules as either a controller or a processor of data. So we encourage you to talk to your legal counsel to evaluate your potential exposure to GDPR and any additional steps that you need to take to be in compliance. It gets complex, and so we encourage all of you to discuss this with your legal counsel, obviously. How do I handle user data deletion requests? If your user asks you to delete their personal data, please reach out to us at team@chatfuel.com, and we will work with you to remove their data individually. At this time, we'll do it sort of in a semi-manual mode, and while we're developing more automated tools to allow you to do it directly without our involvement. And again, if you've passed any of your user data to any third-party services like Zapier, Integromat, a CRM service, your own server somewhere, you're responsible for ensuring that the user data is deleted from those services as well. Can I continue using Chatfuel after May 25? It should be 2018, it says 2017, apologies for that, and be sure that I'm in compliance with GDPR requirements? The answer is yes. We've taken all the necessary steps for Chatfuel to be in compliance with the requirements of GDPR. But accepting the DPA agreement from Chatfuel for you is an important step towards your compliance. So talk to your legal counsel to evaluate your individual organizational processes and understand what you may need to do in addition to this to ensure full compliance for your organization specifically. How do I best communicate the steps Chatfuel has taken to be GDPR compliant? As we discussed today, we've implemented specific legal, technical, and organizational measures aimed to address data privacy and security concerns. And broadly, it can be described as we put in place the contractual measures in the form of data processing agreement in accordance with the GDPR requirements. We've put in place the appropriate contractual measures with each of our data sub-processors, such as cloud service providers and analytics providers. As Dmitry walked us through, we've implemented and documented specific technical and organizational measures to ensure data privacy and security. So thank you. We'll finish this today. It took us a little longer than 45 minutes, but hopefully it gave you a good overview of what GDPR is, how it applies, and what we've done to address it on our end and help you address it as well. And if you have any further questions, please direct them to us at team@chatfuel.com or visit our GDPR portal, so to speak. We'll keep updating it as more questions come in, and we'll be adding information to there as applicable. But soon you'll see the updated DPA in your dashboard, and if any more questions come up, we'd be happy to address them for you. Thank you again for joining, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.